My name is Linda, and I'm 28 years old. I always believed that family came first, that blood was thicker than water, and that parents would always choose their children above everything else. I was wrong. The night I almost died lying unconscious in a hospital bed while doctors fought to save my life, I discovered exactly where I ranked in my parents' priorities. When the doctor called to tell them their daughter might not survive the night, they said they couldn't come because my sister Janet was walking her dog, Princess. That moment changed everything. Before we dive into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share will show you how sometimes the people who should love you most can shatter your heart in ways you never imagined possible. Growing up in suburban Columbus, Ohio, I thought I had the perfect family. We lived in a beautiful two-story house with a white picket fence, and from the outside, we looked like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. My father Harold worked as an insurance manager, and my mother Beverly was a part-time librarian who spent most of her energy making sure our home was spotless and our family appeared flawless to the neighbors. But inside that picture-perfect house, there was an unspoken hierarchy that I didn't fully understand until much later. I was the older daughter born when my parents were young and still figuring out how to be adults themselves. Janet came along 3 years later, and from the moment she arrived, everything shifted. Where I was expected to be responsible, mature, and independent from an early age, Janet was treated like precious porcelain that might break if anyone looked at her wrong. I remember being 7 years old and already making my own breakfast while my mother spent an hour coaxing Janet to eat just 3 spoonfuls of cereal. When I brought home straight A's, it was expected. When Janet brought home C's, it was celebrated because she tried her best. I learned to do my own laundry at 10 because Mom was too busy helping Janet with homework that should have taken 20 minutes, but somehow stretched into 2-hour dramatic productions, complete with tears and tantrums. The pattern continued through high school. I worked 2 part-time jobs to save money for college while maintaining a 4.0 GPA and volunteering at the local animal shelter. Janet barely graduated with a 2.5, but somehow convinced our parents that she deserved a gap year to find herself. That gap year turned into 2 years of living at home rent-free, while I worked my way through Ohio State University, taking out student loans and eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights. When Janet finally decided to attend community college, our parents not only paid her full tuition, but also gave her a monthly allowance for living expenses, even though she was still living in her childhood bedroom. I remember calling home one evening during my junior year, exhausted from pulling an all-nighter to finish a marketing project while working a closing shift at the campus bookstore. I mentioned how tired I was, and my mother's response was to tell me about the new comforter set they'd bought for Janet's room because she said the old one was too depressing. But nothing prepared me for Princess. 3 years ago, Janet decided she needed an emotional support animal. Not just any animal, mind you, but a purebred golden retriever that cost $3,000. Our parents didn't hesitate to write the check. Princess became the fourth member of our family, except she ranked higher than I ever had. I'll never forget the first family dinner after Princess arrived. I had driven 2 hours from my apartment in Cleveland, where I'd moved after graduating and landing my first real job in marketing. I was excited to share news about a promotion. I'd received a significant raise that meant I could finally start paying off my student loans aggressively. I walked into that dining room with a bottle of wine and a smile, ready to celebrate with my family. Instead, I spent the entire evening listening to a detailed account of Princess's first week at home. How she'd learned to sit on command. How she preferred the expensive organic dog food to the regular kind. How Janet had already taught her to shake hands and roll over. My parents hung on every word as if Janet was describing the achievements of a Nobel Prize winner. When I finally managed to interject with my promotion news, my father glanced up from where he was feeding Princess pieces of his steak and said, "That's nice, honey. Beverly, did you see how Princess tilted her head when Janet said her name? I think she's trying to communicate." That was the moment I realized I was competing with a dog for my parents' attention. And losing. Over the next 3 years, the situation only got worse. Princess had her own Instagram account that my mother managed with the devotion of a professional social media manager. She had a wardrobe of sweaters for winter walks and a special bed in every room of the house. When Princess got a minor ear infection, my parents rushed her to an emergency veterinary clinic at 2 in the morning and spent $800 on treatment. Meanwhile, when I mentioned during a phone call that I'd been having persistent headaches, my mother's advice was to drink more water and get more sleep. When I said I was feeling overwhelmed at work, she suggested I learn stress management techniques like Janet had for dealing with Princess's separation anxiety. I started to feel like a ghost in my own family. I'd show up for birthdays and holidays, bringing thoughtful gifts and trying to connect only to find that every conversation somehow circled back to Princess's latest adorable behavior or Janet's newest emotional breakthrough thanks to her therapy dog. The final straw came 6 months ago during Easter dinner. I'd spent the morning preparing a homemade carrot cake, my father's favorite dessert that I'd been making for his birthday since I was 12. I arrived at the house to find that my mother had already bought a store-bought cake because Janet had suggested that Princess might feel left out if there wasn't something special for her too. My homemade cake was relegated to a corner of the counter, while Princess received a pup cake made with organic ingredients and topped with a single candle. As I watched my parents sing Happy Birthday to a dog, while my cake sat untouched, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible in my own family. I was the responsible daughter who could be counted on to show up to bring gifts to remember birthdays and anniversaries, but I wasn't really seen or valued. I was just expected to be there like furniture that nobody notices until it's gone. I started pulling back after that. I still called regularly and attended family gatherings, but I stopped going out of my way to please people who clearly didn't appreciate the effort. I stopped making my father's birthday cake and started bringing store-bought desserts. I stopped volunteering to help with holiday preparations and waited to be asked. Most of the time, I wasn't asked. But I kept trying, kept hoping that somehow I could find my way back into my parents' hearts. I thought maybe if I was patient enough, understanding enough, they'd eventually realize how much they'd been taking me for granted. I never imagined that it would take a life-threatening emergency for me to discover just how little I meant to them. The signs had been there for months, but I'd ignored them the way I'd learned to ignore so many things about my family dynamics. It started with headaches that felt different from the normal tension headaches I'd experienced during stressful periods at work. These were sharp, sudden, and accompanied by a strange sensitivity to light that made me want to hide in dark rooms. I first mentioned them during a family dinner in February. We were sitting around my parents' dining room table, the same table where I'd announced my college acceptance, my graduation, my first job, and countless other milestones that had been overshadowed by whatever Janet needed attention for that week. I was picking at my mother's pot roast, trying to ignore the throbbing in my temples, when my father asked how work was going. "Actually, I've been having some pretty severe headaches lately," I said, setting down my fork. "They're different from anything I've experienced before. Sometimes they're so bad I have to leave work early." My mother looked up from where she was cutting pieces of meat for Princess, who sat beside Janet's chair like a furry queen awaiting her royal feast. "Oh, honey, you're probably just stressed. Have you tried those meditation apps? Janet uses one for her anxiety, and it's been wonderful for both her and Princess. The dog actually falls asleep when Janet plays the nature sounds." "It's not stress, Mom. These headaches are really intense and they come with nausea and dizziness. Sometimes I see spots in my vision." My father nodded absently while reaching down to pet Princess. "You should drink more water. Most headaches are caused by dehydration. Janet makes sure Princess always has fresh water available. Maybe you could learn something from how well she takes care of her." I stared at him, wondering if he'd actually just compared my self-care to my sister's dog care routine. But before I could respond, Janet launched into a detailed story about how Princess had learned to bring her the meditation cushion when she sensed Janet was feeling anxious. The conversation moved on without another word about my health. The headaches got worse over the next few weeks. I started keeping a bottle of ibuprofen in my desk drawer at work and my colleague Roger began commenting on how pale I looked during afternoon meetings. My friend Sharon, who I'd known since college, expressed concern when I had to cancel our regular Thursday night dinners twice in a row because I felt too sick to drive. "Linda, this isn't normal," Sharon said during one of our phone conversations. "You need to see a doctor. These headaches sound serious." "I'm sure it's just work stress," I replied, echoing my mother's dismissive words. "The Johnson campaign has been particularly demanding, and I've been putting in 12-hour days trying to get everything perfect." But deep down, I knew this was different. The headaches were accompanied by moments of confusion where I'd forget what I was doing mid-task. I'd started experiencing brief episodes of dizziness that left me gripping my desk chair until the room stopped spinning. Once I'd actually vomited in the office bathroom after a particularly severe headache hit during a client presentation. I tried bringing it up with my family again during our regular Sunday phone call. Janet had called to update us on Princess's progress in obedience training, and I waited for a lull in the conversation to mention my ongoing health issues. "I'm still having those headaches I mentioned," I said when my mother finally paused her enthusiastic commentary about Princess's ability to sit pretty on command. "They're getting worse, and I'm starting to worry there might be something more serious going on." "Have you been eating enough vegetables?" my mother asked. "Janet's been making these wonderful smoothies for herself and Princess. Well, obviously, Princess gets a different version, but they're both getting so many nutrients. Maybe you should try eating better." "Mom, I eat plenty of vegetables. This isn't about nutrition. I'm having neurological symptoms. Maybe I should see a doctor and get some tests done." There was a pause, and then I heard my father's voice in the background asking about Princess's grooming appointment. My mother's attention immediately shifted. "Oh, that reminds me, we need to reschedule Princess's spa day because Janet has that job interview next week. Linda, honey, I have to go. Janet needs help picking out an outfit, and Princess gets anxious when Janet is stressed about interviews." The call ended with promises to talk soon that I knew wouldn't be kept unless I was the one doing the calling. I made an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Martinez, who I'd been seeing since I moved to Cleveland. He was concerned enough about my symptoms to order blood work and refer me to a neurologist. The blood work came back normal, but the neurologist, Dr. Thompson, wanted to schedule an MRI to rule out any structural problems. "It's probably nothing serious," he assured me after a thorough examination. "But given the severity and frequency of your symptoms, especially the visual disturbances, I'd rather be cautious." The MRI was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, Dr. Thompson prescribed a stronger medication for the headaches and advised me to avoid stress and get plenty of rest. I followed his instructions religiously, even turning down overtime opportunities at work, despite the extra money I could have used. But the headaches continued to worsen. I started experiencing them almost daily, and the medication barely took the edge off. Roger began insisting on driving me home after particularly bad episodes at work, worried that I might pass out behind the wheel. "You need to tell your family how serious this is," he said one evening as he walked me to my apartment door after I'd nearly collapsed during a staff meeting. "They should know what's going on." I tried one more time during what would be my last family dinner before everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in early April, and I'd driven down to Columbus despite feeling particularly unwell. My vision had been blurry all day, and the headache brewing behind my eyes felt like it might split my skull open. I sat at that familiar dining room table watching my parents fuss over Princess's new haircut and Janet's latest drama about a coworker who'd been rude to her. When there was finally a break in conversation, I gathered my courage to try again. "I need to tell you all something important," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "My headaches have gotten much worse. I'm seeing a neurologist and he's ordered some tests because he's concerned about the symptoms I'm experiencing." My mother glanced up briefly from where she was taking photos of Princess with her new pink bow. "That's nice, dear. Did you see how Princess's coat looks after her grooming? The groomer said she's never seen such a well-behaved dog." "Mom, I'm trying to tell you that there might be something seriously wrong with my health." My father looked annoyed at the interruption. Linda, you've always been dramatic about every little ache and pain. Remember when you thought you had appendicitis in high school and it turned out to be gas? You probably just need to relax more. Look at how calm Princess is. Janet's taught her excellent stress management techniques. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, partly from the pain and partly from the crushing realization that even a potential medical crisis couldn't compete with a dog's grooming appointment for my parents' attention. I excused myself early, claiming I had work to catch up on, and drove home through blurry vision and mounting pain. That was the last conversation I had with my family before the night that changed everything. I wish I could say I was surprised by their response when the crisis finally came, but if I'm being honest, their reaction was exactly what I should have expected based on 28 years of being their afterthought daughter. April 15th. Started like any other day, except the headache that greeted me when I woke up was more intense than usual. I'd learned to function with a certain level of pain over the past few months, so I took my medication, drank an extra cup of coffee, and headed to the office determined to push through another day. I was working late on the Henderson account, a major marketing campaign that needed to be finalized before the weekend. The office was mostly empty by 7 p.m. with just me and a few other dedicated team members burning the midnight oil. I'd been staring at my computer screen for hours making final adjustments to presentation slides when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The headache that had been my constant companion all day exploded into something beyond pain. It felt like someone had detonated a bomb inside my skull. The fluorescent lights overhead became unbearably bright, and nausea rolled through my stomach in violent waves. I gripped the edge of my desk, trying to steady myself as the room began to spin. "Linda, are you okay?" I heard Roger's voice as if it was coming from very far away, even though he was sitting just 2 desks over. I tried to answer him, but the words wouldn't come. My tongue felt thick and uncooperative, and when I attempted to stand up, my legs buckled beneath me. The last thing I remember was Roger shouting my name and the sensation of falling forward into darkness so complete it swallowed me whole. I have fragmented memories of what happened next. The wail of sirens, bright lights flashing red and blue through the office windows, voices speaking in urgent clipped tones about blood pressure and neurological responses. The sensation of being lifted onto a stretcher, my body feeling disconnected from my consciousness, like I was watching someone else's medical emergency unfold. In the ambulance, I drifted in and out of awareness. During the lucid moments, I caught pieces of conversation between the paramedics that made my blood run cold despite my confused state. Blood pressure's dropping fast. Pupils are unequal and sluggish. ETA to Metro General is 8 minutes. Call ahead and tell them we've got a possible brain bleed. Brain bleed. The words echoed in my fading consciousness as I slipped back into the darkness. The emergency room at Metro General was a blur of controlled chaos. I remember brief flashes of being rushed through automatic doors, ceiling tiles flying past overhead, and the urgent voices of medical professionals coordinating my care. Dr. Samuel, the emergency room physician, became the voice I heard most clearly during my moments of consciousness. "We need a CT scan immediately," he was saying to someone I couldn't see. "And get neurology down here now. I'm seeing signs of increased intracranial pressure." I wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to understand what was happening to my body. But speaking required an energy I didn't possess. Instead, I found myself floating in and out of awareness as tests were performed and medical equipment beeped around me. It was during one of these semi-conscious moments that I heard Dr. Samuel speaking to a nurse about contacting my emergency contacts. My work had provided them with my insurance information and the emergency contact form I'd filled out when I started my job 3 years ago. My parents were listed first, followed by Sharon as my backup contact. "I need to make this call immediately." Dr. Samuel was saying, his voice carrying the weight of urgency that I would later understand meant he genuinely believed I might not survive the night. "The patient has suffered a significant brain hemorrhage and the next few hours are critical." I heard him dialing, heard the faint sound of ringing through the phone's speaker. When my father's familiar voice answered, I felt a wave of relief wash over me despite my dire circumstances. Finally, my family would know how serious this was. Finally, they would understand that I needed them. But what I heard next would haunt me for the rest of my life. Mr. Johnson, this is Dr. Samuel from Metro General Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter Linda. She's been brought to our emergency room with a severe brain hemorrhage and her condition is extremely critical. There was a pause, and then my father's voice sounding more annoyed than concerned. Well, what exactly does that mean? Is she conscious? Sir, your daughter is in life-threatening condition. We're doing everything we can, but I need to be honest with you. Tonight might be her last night. I strongly recommend that you and your wife come to the hospital immediately. Another pause. Longer this time. I held my breath waiting for my father to say they were on their way, that they would be there as fast as possible. Instead, I heard the words that shattered what remained of my heart. Doctor, I appreciate you calling, but we can't come tonight. Our other daughter is taking her emotional support dog for a walk, and we can't leave her alone. Princess gets very anxious if her routine is disrupted, and Janet can't handle that kind of stress by herself. I thought I had misheard. Surely my father hadn't just said that they couldn't come to see their potentially dying daughter because of a dog's walk schedule. But Dr. Samuel's shocked silence confirmed that I had heard correctly. Sir, I want to make sure you understand the gravity of the situation. Your daughter Linda may not survive the night. This could be your last opportunity to see her. My mother's voice joined the conversation, then apparently having taken the phone from my father. Doctor, you don't understand. Our daughter Janet has severe anxiety, and her therapy dog Princess is the only thing that keeps her calm. If we leave while Janet is doing the evening walk routine, it could trigger a panic attack. We simply can't risk Janet's mental health for what might just be another one of Linda's dramatic episodes. Ma'am, this is not a dramatic episode. Your daughter is unconscious with a brain hemorrhage. She's fighting for her life. Well, if she's unconscious, then she won't know whether we're there or not, will she? My mother replied with a logic so twisted it defied comprehension. Janet will definitely know if we abandon her during Princess's walk time. We'll try to come by tomorrow if the situation is still ongoing. The phone went dead. I lay there in that hospital bed, machines beeping around me, listening to Dr. Samuel explained to Nurse Marie that he had never in 20 years of emergency medicine encountered family members who refused to come to the hospital because of a dog's walking schedule. The staff exchanged glances that I caught, even through my fragmented consciousness, looks that conveyed their complete bewilderment at what they had just witnessed. That's when Nurse Marie suggested calling my backup emergency contact. Sharon answered on the first ring, and within minutes of Dr. Samuel explaining the situation, she was racing toward the hospital, crying and promising she would be there soon. As I drifted back into unconsciousness, my last coherent thought was the devastating realization that in my family's hierarchy of priorities, I ranked somewhere below a golden retriever's evening constitutional. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just chosen a dog's comfort over their daughter's life. And somehow I wasn't even surprised. The conversation I had overheard between Dr. Samuel and my parents played on repeat in my mind during the brief moments of consciousness over the next several hours. Each time I surfaced from the medicated haze, the reality of their words hit me like a physical blow more painful than the emergency brain surgery I underwent that first night. Dr. Samuel had explained my condition to Sharon when she arrived, tears streaming down her face and clutching a small overnight bag she'd hastily packed with items from my apartment. I had suffered what he called a spontaneous intracerebral hemorrhage, essentially a brain bleed that could have killed me within hours if Roger hadn't found me when he did. The surgery had been successful in stopping the bleeding and relieving the pressure on my brain, but the next 48 hours would be critical in determining whether I would make a full recovery. Has anyone else from her family been contacted? Sharon asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside my bed that would become her second home over the next week. Dr. Samuel's expression darkened slightly. We spoke with her parents. They were unable to come tonight due to a conflict with their other daughter's pet care routine. Sharon's face went through a series of emotions that I watched through half-closed eyes. Confusion, disbelief, and then pure anger. I'm sorry, did you say they couldn't come because of a pet? That's correct. They indicated that their other daughter was walking her emotional support dog and that disrupting this routine would be problematic. Linda's fighting for her life, and they're worried about a dog walk. Sharon's voice rose with incredulity before she caught herself and lowered it again, glancing at my still form. Doctor, I need you to understand something. Linda has spent her entire life being second place to her sister, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. Over the next 24 hours, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I became aware of Sharon maintaining a constant vigil beside my bed. She spoke to me continuously, even when the doctors weren't sure I could hear her telling me about work gossip, reading articles from magazines, and updating me on the progress of my recovery. Your brain scans are looking better, she would say, squeezing my hand. Dr. Samuel says the swelling is going down exactly as they hoped. You're going to be okay, Linda. You're stronger than they know. By the second day, when I was conscious for longer periods and able to speak in short sentences, Sharon filled me in on the calls she'd been making on my behalf. She had contacted my office to explain my situation, and Roger had immediately organized a meal train and flour delivery to the hospital. My coworkers, people I saw every day but didn't consider particularly close friends, had shown more concern for my well-being than my own parents. Has anyone from my family called? I asked on the third day, though I already knew the answer from Sharon's expression. Janet called yesterday, Sharon admitted reluctantly, but not to ask about you. She wanted to know if the hospital was sure they had called the right family because she said her parents seemed upset about something and Princess was picking up on the negative energy. I closed my eyes, letting that information sink in. Even now, with me lying in a hospital bed recovering from emergency brain surgery, my sister's primary concern was her dog's emotional state. What did you tell her? I told her that her sister had nearly died, and that maybe her parents' upset had something to do with missing the chance to be here when you needed them most. Sharon's voice carried an edge of anger that she'd been containing for days. She said she didn't understand why everyone was being so dramatic about a headache. A headache. 28 years of my life and my near-death experience was being dismissed as a headache. Dr. Thompson, the neurologist who had been trying to schedule my MRI before the hemorrhage, visited on the fourth day to check on my recovery and explain what had likely caused my condition. The headaches I'd been experiencing for months had been warning signs of a vascular malformation in my brain that had finally ruptured. If I had been able to get that MRI sooner, they might have caught it before it became life-threatening. The important thing is that you're going to make a full recovery, he assured me. But I have to ask, why didn't you seek treatment sooner when the headaches became severe? You mentioned during your initial consultation that you'd tried to discuss them with family members. I found myself explaining the dynamic I'd grown up with, how my health concerns had been consistently minimized and dismissed. Dr. Thompson listened with growing concern, making notes in my chart, and occasionally exchanging glances with Sharon. Linda, I want you to understand something, he said when I finished. The symptoms you described to me during our first meeting, if you had presented them to any emergency room in the country, would have resulted in immediate imaging and likely prevented this hemorrhage entirely. The fact that the people closest to you dismissed these warning signs, he paused, choosing his words carefully, that's not normal family behavior. By the fifth day, I was well enough to walk short distances and eat solid food. The constant stream of visitors from my workplace had created a steady rotation of flowers, cards, and well wishes that made my hospital room look like a florist's shop. Roger had even arranged for my laptop to be brought, so I could work on light tasks when I felt up to it, though mostly I used it to research brain hemorrhages and recovery timelines. It was during one of these research sessions that I discovered how lucky I was to be alive. The type of hemorrhage I'd suffered had a significant mortality rate, and even survivors often faced long-term neurological deficits. The fact that I was recovering so well was what Dr. Samuel called miraculous, though he credited the quick response time and excellent surgical team rather than divine intervention. "You should be proud of how hard you fought," Sharon said on the sixth evening, watching me navigate around the room without assistance for the first time. "I know this isn't how you imagined spending your week, but watching you recover has been incredible." "I keep thinking about what you said," I replied, settling back into the hospital bed that had become more familiar than my own bedroom. "About how this isn't normal family behavior. I've spent so many years making excuses for them, convincing myself that I was being too sensitive or asking for too much attention. Linda, you nearly died. You had emergency brain surgery. The fact that they haven't even called to check on you," Sharon shook her head. "That's not about sensitivity or attention seeking. That's about basic human decency." That night, as Sharon went home to shower and sleep in her own bed for the first time in 6 days, I lay in the quiet hospital room thinking about the life I would return to. My apartment in Cleveland, my job at the marketing firm, my routine of weekly calls home and monthly family dinners where I pretended everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Nothing had ever been normal. I thought about the letter Dr. Samuel had written for my medical leave, the documentation of what I'd survived and how my family would probably react when I eventually told them about it. Would they minimize it, the same way they'd minimized everything else? Would they find a way to make it about Janet and Princess? As I drifted off to sleep on my 6th night in the hospital, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life. I couldn't go back to pretending that their behavior was acceptable. I couldn't continue participating in a family dynamic where I was consistently valued less than a dog. I was going to write a letter, and then I was going to disappear. On the 7th morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The neurological fog that had clouded my thinking since the hemorrhage had finally lifted, and for the first time since my emergency surgery, I felt completely like myself again. Dr. Samuel had already mentioned that I would likely be discharged that afternoon if my morning tests continued to show improvement. I had been lying awake since 5 a.m. watching the sunrise through my hospital room window and thinking about the conversation I'd overheard between him and my parents. Every time I replayed those words, the wound felt fresh. Not just the immediate rejection, but the lifetime of smaller rejections that had led to this moment where they could so casually dismiss my life-threatening emergency. Sharon arrived at 8 with coffee and the newspaper, her usual morning routine that had become precious to me over the past week. She'd taken vacation time from her job as a high school guidance counselor to stay with me sleeping in that uncomfortable plastic chair and advocating with the medical staff when I was too weak to speak for myself. "You look different today," she observed, settling into what we'd started calling her chair. "More like yourself." "I feel different," I admitted. "Clearer. Like I've been looking at my life through a fog for years, and it's finally lifted." The neurologist said cognitive clarity often improves significantly once the brain swelling goes down completely. "It's not just medical clarity, Sharon. It's emotional clarity, too." I turned to face her fully. "I've made a decision about what I'm going to do when I leave here." I explained my plan while she listened with growing concern. I was going to write a letter to my parents explaining exactly how their behavior had affected me not just during this medical emergency, but throughout my entire life. Then I was going to leave Cleveland, take the job opportunity that Roger had mentioned in Portland, and start completely over. "Linda, I understand you're hurt, and you have every right to be angry with them, but cutting off all contact, that's a huge decision to make while you're still recovering from brain surgery." "I'm not making this decision because of the surgery," I replied. "I'm making it because of 28 years of evidence that I don't matter to them. The medical emergency just made it impossible to ignore anymore." I spent the next several hours drafting the letter on my laptop, writing and rewriting until I had captured everything I needed to say. It wasn't angry or accusatory, though I felt both of those emotions. Instead, it was honest and factual, a straightforward explanation of how their choices had affected me and what my response would be. The letter began by acknowledging that I understood they had priorities other than me, and that I accepted this as their right as adults making their own decisions. I outlined specific examples of times when their dismissal of my needs had been particularly hurtful, including the recent months when I'd tried to communicate about my health concerns. Then I described what I had overheard during Dr. Samuel's phone call, quoting their exact words about not being able to leave Janet and Princess. I explained that hearing them prioritize a dog's walking routine over their daughter's life had crystallized something I'd been unwilling to admit for years, that I would never be important enough to them to justify changing their behavior. The letter concluded by informing them that I was relocating to Portland for a new job opportunity and that I would not be maintaining contact with them going forward. I made it clear that this wasn't a punishment or an attempt to manipulate them into treating me better, but simply a recognition that we wanted different things from a family relationship. I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn a place in your hearts that you've already given to someone else, I wrote. I'm finally ready to stop competing for love that should have been freely given. Roger visited that afternoon while I was finalizing the letter. He'd brought paperwork from the office and an official job offer from his former colleague in Portland, who ran a boutique marketing agency specializing in sustainable brands. The position starts as soon as you're ready, he explained. Sarah, the agency owner, was impressed by the portfolio I showed her of your work on the Henderson campaign. She's offering a 20% salary increase and full relocation assistance. That's incredibly generous, especially for someone she's never met. I may have mentioned that you were recovering from a medical emergency and looking for a fresh start. Sarah's been through her own family drama, so she understands the need to sometimes start over somewhere new. By evening, everything was arranged. Sharon had agreed to help me pack up my Cleveland apartment and ship my belongings to Portland. Roger had volunteered to handle my resignation and the transition of my current projects to other team members. Most importantly, I had a plan that felt like hope instead of obligation for the first time in years. Dr. Samuel completed my discharge paperwork that evening, expressing amazement at my recovery speed and cognitive function. I've seen patients with much less severe hemorrhages take weeks longer to reach this level of functioning, he said. Your brain seems remarkably resilient. Maybe it's because I finally have something to heal toward instead of just surviving, I suggested. As I prepared to leave the hospital that had been my sanctuary for a week, I printed 2 copies of the letter I'd written. One would be left on my empty hospital bed for my parents to find when they finally decided to visit. The other would go with me to Portland as a reminder of the moment I chose myself over their dysfunction. Nurse Marie, who had been checking on me regularly since that first night, stopped by my room as I was gathering my few personal belongings. I wanted to tell you something before you left, she said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. In 15 years of nursing, I've never seen a patient handle family abandonment with as much grace as you have this week. Whatever you're planning for your future, I hope it brings you the love and respect you deserve. I hugged her goodbye, this woman who had shown me more care during my medical crisis than my own parents had in years. Then I walked out of Metro General Hospital with Sharon beside me, carrying my letter and my hope for a different kind of life. We drove straight to my parents' house. The familiar sight of my childhood home filled me with an unexpected calmness as Sharon pulled into the driveway. The white colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and blooming flower beds looked exactly as it had during countless visits over the years. But for the first time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a museum of a life I'd outgrown. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sharon asked, turning off the engine. "We could just mail the letter." "No, they need to find it themselves. They need to come looking for me and discover that I'm gone." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It's the only way they'll understand that this isn't a dramatic gesture or a cry for attention. It's a decision. We could see lights on in the kitchen and living room, and through the front window I caught a glimpse of my father reading in his favorite armchair, while Princess lay curled up on the expensive dog bed beside him. The scene looked so normal, so peaceful, as if the past week of my medical emergency had never happened. "How do you want to do this?" Sharon asked. I'd thought this through during the drive over. My parents had a spare key hidden under a decorative rock near the front door, a security measure that had never changed since I was a teenager. They'd be in their usual evening routine. My father reading while my mother watched television. Janet probably in her room with Princess, everyone settled into the comfortable predictability that had made them unable to disrupt their schedule for my potential death. I'm going to go and place the letter somewhere they'll find it and leave. I don't want to see them or have a confrontation. This isn't about getting the last word or making them feel guilty. It's about closure. Sharon nodded, understanding the distinction. "I'll wait here. Take as long as you need." I retrieved the spare key and let myself into the house where I'd grown up, moving quietly through the familiar rooms. The living room looked exactly as it always had, with my mother's carefully arranged throw pillows and my father's stack of insurance journals on the side table. I could hear the murmur of the television from the family room and my father's occasional comments to Princess. I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom, which my mother had converted into a craft room years ago. The single bed was still there, covered with a quilt my grandmother had made, and the walls still held some of my high school achievement certificates that hadn't seemed worth taking when I moved out. This felt like the right place to leave the letter. Not on the kitchen table where they might miss it, or in the living room where it might get lost among magazines and mail. Here in the space that had once been mine, where I'd spent countless nights dreaming about a future where I mattered to the people who were supposed to love me most. I placed the letter on the pillow, weighted down with a small ceramic figurine from the dresser so it wouldn't blow away if anyone opened a window. Then I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking around at the remnants of my childhood and adolescence. The room told the story of a girl who had tried very hard to be worthy of love. Academic achievement awards, perfect attendance certificates, photos from volunteer activities and part-time jobs. Evidence of someone who had learned early that love had to be earned through accomplishment and good behavior. Someone who had spent years trying to solve the puzzle of how to be valuable enough to matter. But sitting there in that quiet room, preparing to walk away from the family I'd been trying to please for 28 years, I finally understood that it had never been a puzzle I could solve. Their inability to love me the way I needed wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their capacity. I heard Janet's voice downstairs, probably talking to Princess in the baby voice she used with the dog. My parents' responses were immediate and engaged, the kind of attentive interaction I'd craved my entire life. The contrast between their response to Janet's presence and their absence during my medical emergency couldn't have been more stark. Standing up from the bed, I took one last look around the room and realized I felt no sadness about leaving. Instead, I felt something I'd rarely experienced in this house: peace. I made my way back downstairs and out the front door, replacing the spare key under its rock and walking back to Sharon's car with steady steps. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the house or feel any urge to change my mind about what I'd done. "How do you feel?" Sharon asked, as we headed toward my apartment to begin packing. "Free," I answered, and meant it completely. We spent the next several hours boxing up my belongings, a process that went faster than expected because I'd never accumulated much during my years in Cleveland. My furniture was basic, my possessions practical rather than sentimental. The most emotional part was packing the photo albums that documented my life, filled with pictures of achievements and milestones that had been celebrated by friends rather than family. My phone remained silent throughout the evening. No calls from my parents. No texts asking where I was or when I'd be coming for our usual family dinner that weekend. Their obliviousness to my absence felt like final confirmation that I was making the right decision. By midnight, my entire Cleveland life was packed into a dozen boxes and 3 suitcases. Sharon had arranged for a moving company to pick everything up the next day and transport it to Portland, where Roger's friend Sarah had already helped me secure a furnished apartment near the marketing agency. "I can't believe you're really doing this," Sharon said as we sat in my empty living room sharing a bottle of wine and eating takeout Chinese food off paper plates. I can't believe it took me this long, I replied. All those years of trying to figure out what I was doing wrong, how I could be a better daughter, why I couldn't make them care about me the way they cared about Janet and Princess. You know, this isn't really about the dog, right? Princess is just the most obvious symbol of how they've always treated you. She was right, of course. The emergency surgery and my parents' response had simply stripped away all the rationalizations and excuses I'd been making for years. Without the fog of hope and denial clouding my vision, I could see our family dynamic with perfect clarity. I fell asleep that night on an air mattress in my empty apartment with Sharon sleeping in a sleeping bag beside me, like we were having a childhood sleepover. For the first time in months, I didn't have a headache. For the first time in years, I slept deeply and peacefully without the underlying anxiety that had become so familiar I'd stopped noticing it. The next morning, I boarded a plane to Portland carrying only a single suitcase and a laptop bag. Sharon hugged me goodbye at the airport, making me promise to call when I landed, and to remember that chosen family could be stronger than biological family. As the plane lifted off from Cleveland, I watched the city grow smaller below me and felt nothing but anticipation for what came next. I'd left behind more than just a geographic location. I'd left behind the version of myself who believed that love had to be earned and that family dysfunction was something to be endured rather than escaped. I was flying toward a life where I wouldn't have to compete with a dog for basic human decency, where my medical emergencies wouldn't be dismissed as dramatic episodes where my achievements might actually be celebrated instead of overshadowed. I was flying toward the radical concept of being someone's priority. Portland welcomed me with rain and possibilities. Sarah met me at the airport, a woman in her 40s with short silver hair and the kind of confident energy that immediately put me at ease. During the drive to my new apartment, she shared her own story of leaving toxic family relationships behind and building a life centered on people who valued her contributions. The marketing world is full of people who understand that sometimes you have to choose yourself, she said as we navigated through the city's tree-lined streets. My agency has become a bit of a refuge for professionals who needed fresh starts. My apartment was in a converted warehouse building in the Pearl District with huge windows that let in natural light and a view of the mountains that made me catch my breath. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere that felt like home immediately, rather than just a place to sleep between family obligations. The job exceeded every expectation I'd had. Sarah's agency specialized in sustainable brands and social impact marketing work that felt meaningful in a way my previous corporate position never had. My colleagues were collaborative rather than competitive, and my ideas were not only heard, but actively sought out and implemented. But the most significant change was how differently I felt in my own skin. Without the constant low-level stress of trying to earn my family's attention and approval, I discovered energy and creativity I'd forgotten I possessed. My headaches disappeared completely, and for the first time since college, I began sleeping through the night without anxiety dreams. 3 weeks after my arrival in Portland, my phone rang with a call from my parents. I stared at the screen for several rings before deciding to answer, curious about what had finally prompted them to notice my absence. "Linda, where are you?" My mother's voice was sharp with annoyance rather than concern. "We went to the hospital to visit you and your room was empty. The staff said you'd been discharged a week ago, but you never came home." "I left you a letter explaining everything," I replied calmly. "Did you read it?" "Of course we read your dramatic little note. We don't understand why you're being so unreasonable about a simple misunderstanding." A simple misunderstanding. I had to laugh at their ability to minimize what had happened even now. "Mom, I nearly died from a brain hemorrhage and you told the doctor you couldn't come to the hospital because Janet was walking Princess. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice. You're taking everything out of context." My father's voice joined the conversation. "We were planning to come the next day. We couldn't abandon Janet during a vulnerable moment. But you could abandon me during a potentially fatal medical emergency. That's different and you know it. You've always been independent and strong. Janet needs more support." There it was, the logic that had governed my entire childhood. I was strong, so I didn't need love and attention. Janet was fragile, so she deserved all the care and consideration our family had to offer. "You're right," I said, surprising them with my agreement. "I am strong. Strong enough to build a life with people who value me, strong enough to stop accepting crumbs from people who should love me unconditionally, and strong enough to recognize that I deserve better than what you've given me." "Linda, you're being ridiculous," my mother said. "Just come home and we can talk about this like adults." I am home. I live in Portland now. I have a job, I love friends who actually care about my well-being, and for the first time in my life, I'm not competing with a dog for basic human decency. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about their capacity for self-reflection. "Don't be dramatic," my father finally said. "You can't just cut off your family because of one incident." "It wasn't one incident, Dad. It was 28 years of incidents. The hospital emergency was just the one that finally made me see clearly." I ended the call without anger, just with a deep sense of completion. They would never understand why their behavior had been hurtful, because understanding would require acknowledging that they had failed me as parents. That acknowledgement was beyond their emotional capability. Over the following months, they called occasionally, usually when some family event made my absence inconvenient for them. I answered sometimes and ignored the calls other times depending on my mood and energy level. The conversations followed the same pattern. They would minimize what had happened, I would explain why their behavior had been unacceptable, and they would respond with variations of calling me oversensitive or dramatic. But something interesting began happening during this period. The more distance I maintained from their dysfunction, the more clearly I could see how abnormal our family dynamic had always been. Friends and colleagues who heard pieces of my story were consistently shocked by my parents' behavior, confirming what Dr. Thompson had told me in the hospital about normal family responses to medical emergencies. Sharon visited me in Portland 6 months after my move, marveling at the transformation she saw in me. "You look younger," she observed during dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Willamette River, "and happier than I've seen you since college. I feel like I'm finally living my own life instead of auditioning for a role in someone else's," I replied. I never realized how much energy I was spending trying to make them love me the way they loved Janet. "Have you heard anything about how they're dealing with your absence?" According to the few family friends who still contact me, they've told everyone that I moved to Portland for a job opportunity and that we talk regularly. They're maintaining the fiction that we're still close, probably because explaining the truth would require admitting they chose a dog over their daughter's life. A year after leaving Cleveland, I received an unexpected call from Janet. She was crying, which immediately put me on guard because Janet's tears had always been weaponized in our family to manipulate sympathy and attention. "Linda, I need you to come home," she sobbed. "Princess is sick, and I can't handle this alone. Mom and Dad are being so supportive, but I need my sister too." The irony was breathtaking. Princess's illness merited my immediate return, but my brain hemorrhage hadn't warranted their presence. "I'm sorry Princess is sick," I said genuinely, because despite everything I didn't wish suffering on an innocent animal. "But I'm not coming back to Cleveland, and I'm not coming back to being the family member who only matters when someone needs something from me." "You're being so selfish," Janet accused, her tears immediately disappearing. "This is about Princess's life. And my medical emergency was about my life, but that didn't bring you to the hospital either. That was different. You were unconscious. You didn't know if we were there or not." I heard every word of the conversation when the doctor called Mom and Dad. I heard them choose Princess's walk over their daughter's potential death. "And now you want me to drop everything for Princess's illness." The call ended with Janet hanging up on me, but not before calling me selfish and heartless for refusing to prioritize a dog over my own boundaries and mental health. 2 years into my Portland life, I met David, an environmental lawyer who understood the concept of chosen family because he'd had to create his own after leaving an abusive childhood behind. Our relationship developed, slowly built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than the performance and competition that had characterized my family relationships. When I told him my story, his response was immediate and validating. "They didn't just fail you during your medical emergency," he said. "They failed you every day for 28 years. The hospital incident was just the most obvious example." David proposed on a hiking trail overlooking Mount Hood, and we planned a small wedding celebration with our chosen family of friends and supportive colleagues. I sent my parents an invitation not because I expected them to attend, but because I wanted to give them one final opportunity to show up for something important in my life. They didn't respond to the invitation. Sharon was my maid of honor. Roger walked me down the aisle, and Sarah from my office hosted the reception at her beautiful home in the mountains. It was a perfect day celebrating love and commitment with people who had consistently shown up for me when it mattered. 3 years after leaving Cleveland, I learned through a mutual family friend that Princess had died of old age and that Janet was devastated. The friend mentioned that my parents were considering getting Janet another emotional support animal and wondered if I thought that was a good idea. I realized that even now, even after 3 years of no contact, they were still soliciting my opinion about Janet's needs, while never once asking about my life, my marriage, or my happiness. That conversation crystallized the final piece of my healing journey. I would always be the afterthought daughter in their minds, the one expected to give advice and support while receiving neither in return. The family dynamic that had shaped my first 28 years would never change, because it served their needs perfectly. But it no longer served mine, and I was finally free from any obligation to participate in it. 5 years have passed since I walked out of that Cleveland hospital and into a life where I don't have to compete for love. I'm 33 now, settled into a marriage that feels like a partnership rather than a performance, leading a marketing team at Sarah's agency that has grown into one of Portland's most respected sustainable business consultancies. The woman I am now would barely recognize the person who spent decades trying to earn scraps of attention from people who had already given their hearts to someone else. I wake up each morning in a home where I'm valued, work with colleagues who respect my contributions, and spend my evenings with a husband who considers my well-being a priority rather than an inconvenience. My health has been excellent since leaving Cleveland. The neurologist here who monitors my recovery says my brain scans show complete healing from the hemorrhage with no indication of lasting damage or increased risk of future incidents. It's almost as if removing the chronic stress of dysfunctional family relationships allowed my body to heal itself completely. Last month, I received a call from Sharon with news that my father had suffered a heart attack. He survived and was recovering well, but the incident had apparently prompted some family reflection about mortality and relationships. My mother had asked Sharon if she thought I might be willing to visit or at least call to check on his progress. "What did you tell her?" I asked Sharon during our weekly phone conversation. "I told her that if they wanted to contact you, they had your number. I also mentioned that you'd been hoping for 5 years that they would call to ask about your life, rather than only reaching out when they needed something." The call never came. 2 weeks later, I learned through the same family friend who had told me about Princess's death that my parents had told relatives I was too busy with my new life to contact them during Dad's health scare. Once again, they had crafted a narrative that protected them from having to acknowledge their own role in our estrangement. But their version of events no longer had the power to hurt me. I'd spent 5 years building a life filled with people who celebrate my successes, support me during challenges, and show up consistently rather than only when convenient. I'd learned the difference between love and obligation, between family and biology, between being needed and being valued. David and I are expecting our first child this spring, a daughter we plan to name Hope. We've spent months preparing not just a nursery, but a foundation of unconditional love and consistent presence that she'll never have to earn or compete for. She'll grow up knowing that medical emergencies bring family running, that achievements are celebrated rather than minimized, and that her value isn't determined by how little attention she requires. Sometimes I imagine what my life would have looked like if I'd never had that brain hemorrhage, if I'd continued participating in the dysfunction until my parents died, and left me with a lifetime of regret about never earning their love. I might have spent decades more in weekly therapy sessions trying to understand why I felt so empty despite doing everything right. I might have chosen partners who treated me as an afterthought because that felt familiar. I might have had children and unconsciously repeated patterns that had damaged me. Instead, that terrifying medical emergency became the crisis that saved my life in ways that had nothing to do with neurosurgery. It forced me to see clearly what I'd been unwilling to acknowledge, that some people, even parents, simply don't have the capacity to love the way their children need to be loved. The letter I left on my hospital bed 5 years ago ended with these words: "I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn a place in your hearts that you've already given to someone else. I'm finally ready to stop competing for love that should have been freely given." Today I understand that the most profound act of self-love is walking away from people who consistently choose to hurt you even when those people are supposed to love you unconditionally. Everyone deserves to be someone's priority, and if your family won't make you one, you have the power to create a new family who will. My parents chose my sister's dog over my life that night when I almost died. In response, I chose myself over their dysfunction. It was the best decision I've ever made. If you've been questioning your own worth because of how family members treat you, I want you to know that their inability to love you properly isn't a reflection of your value. You deserve consistent presence, genuine celebration of your achievements, and immediate response during emergencies. You deserve to be someone's priority. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is permission to stop trying to earn what should have been freely given. Sometimes walking away from toxic family relationships is the only way to discover what healthy love actually looks like. I found my family in Portland in chosen relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care. They're the people who show up, who celebrate with me, who mourn with me, and who would never consider a dog's walking schedule more important than my life. That's what real family looks like, and everyone deserves to experience it. What's your story with family priorities and chosen relationships? Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to walk away from people who consistently undervalued you? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's support each other in choosing relationships that honor our worth. Don't forget to like this video. If my story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better than competing for love. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is choose yourself. Until next time, may you always know your worth and surround yourself with people who see it too.